Hi, my name is Kenari Barber, and the grade that I have chosen for our video assignment is 5th grade, and I've chosen the subject science, and I want to talk about the butterfly cycle and the environmental changes. I just wrote down everything that I'm gonna say. So basically, I would use the think aloud strategy to model critical thinking while my class and I observe how environmental changes affects the butterfly's life cycle. Think aloud allows students to listen to reasonings instead of focusing on one correct answer, and they will be able to understand how conclusions are made. So first, I will begin with a slideshow to capture my students' attention. So I would be standing in the front of the classroom while my students are sitting at their desk. I will begin my slideshow by showing them different pictures of butterflies and what butterfly looks like inside of a cold environment, or in a hot environment, or in a normal environment. And I'll show videos and capture how they look and how they act when they're in the cold versus where they're in the hot. As I'm showing the slideshow, I will then pause my slideshow and provide a scenario to my class by saying, if a butterfly's classroom suddenly changed to cold temperature rather than normal temperature, what would happen to the butterfly's life cycle? Would it change this? Would it stay the same? Would some stages be changed, or would they not survive at all? Before allowing my students to answer, I will first model my own think aloud process. And I'll provide some assumptions that I may think that would happen if the butterfly was in a colder temperature. So I would assume that butterflies need specific environmental factors to live and survive. I would also assume that temperature can affect the development process of a butterfly. And I assume that if a stage in the cycle is affected, the other stages will be too. So while I'm providing my assumptions to my classroom, I would want to be looking around to see if my students are maybe trying to come up with any of their assumptions that they may have, or I'm looking to see if they're writing down any of some ideas that they may have while I was giving my assumptions. I would encourage them to think about their thoughts first and their opinions first before shouting it out. I would want to encourage them to think of all their possible outcomes and think of why they would have those possible outcomes. What evidence do they have based on prior knowledge, or if we have been going over this topic before and we have taken some notes, or we have a textbook. I would encourage them to go back into their textbook or into their notes to come up with their evidence or their reasonings to support their perspective. So I would model my thought process first to encourage them. So my first branch would be temperature affects development. If the caterpillar is too cold, then it might stay in that stage too long before it actually becomes a chrysalis and escapes the caterpillar shell. My next branch would be food availability. Is the coldness too cold for plants to grow? Because butterflies eat plants. Also, butterflies eat oranges. So if we're putting the oranges in their little net, for example, we had a butterfly in our classroom. If it's too cold in there, would the plants die? Would they not grow? So now the butterfly cannot eat the plants? Would the oranges dry out because they're too cold? Or would they stay juicy? Because the butterflies like the juice from the oranges. So would the coldness be too cold for the food to stay good enough for the butterfly? Because if so, then limited food could affect the development in the butterfly. My next branch would be, could behavior change if too cold? Could they become less active? So for example, let's say they go through their whole butterfly stage life cycle and they make it past the caterpillar stage. When they actually form into butterflies and they escape from the caterpillar, will they be flying slow? Will they be flying more fast? Did the coldness hinder them? Are their wings not good enough? So that would be my next branch. Would it affect their behavior? While I model my branches, I am explaining that critical thinking is not just about finding the right answer. It is about considering multiple outcomes with evidence. So as I'm going through my branches, I would probably be using prior knowledge, because in my head, I'm assuming that we would already be talking about the butterfly's life cycle, and we would actually have a pet butterfly in there, a caterpillar in our classroom, multiple, so we can check each one and see how each one is developing with hot temperature, cold temperature, and normal temperature. And so we will be looking if what happened to the caterpillar who was too hot, or what happened to the caterpillar who was too cold, or who was under normal temperature. I would encourage my students to look at their observations and look at what is happening to the butterflies that are in our classroom, and I will be giving my evidence. So for example, maybe the caterpillar that's too hot is cracking earlier than the other caterpillars who are too cold. I would use that as, oh, well, temperature can affect how long the caterpillar will be a caterpillar, because if it is cold, then it may crack sooner. If it's hot, it may crack sooner. I would encourage them to use their observation skills, which is a part of critical thinking, to determine that reasoning. Food availability, I would be looking at the plants that we have inside of the food. So most of my strategies would be observations, along with think aloud, because I would want them to observe first and then think aloud. So I would, put emphasis on, how does the plants look inside of the butterfly's net? How does the oranges look inside the butterfly net? Are they dried out? Does it look like the plants are dying? Things of that nature. If our butterflies hatched or came out of their cocoons, we would track, how are they flying? Does one seem lazy? Does one just want to lay down or sit down, land? Or does one want to fly around the net really, really fast? So I would just use observation. I would encourage my students to use observations as well, to focus on their evidence, because I would encourage them to understand that it's about considering multiple outcomes to figure out which one is the best outcome based on the evidence that you have. I would ask my students which option is more likely based off the evidence and the facts that we know. So after that discussion, I will then allow my students to work in groups if they would like to, or if they prefer to work by themselves, they can work by themselves to fill out a diagram with different outcomes for the butterfly, with different reasonings being a requirement. So I would want them to make a small diagram saying, if the temperature is cold, the butterfly will blank. If the temperature is hot, the butterfly will blank, and things like that. For my students that are diverse learners, I would definitely allow them vocabulary cards that have vocabulary words such as environment, affect, change, adapt, words like that connects to the butterfly life cycle. I would also allow my students to verbally explain before they actually fill out their diagram, because I know that sometimes it's easier for students to verbally explain rather than finding the words to put it on a piece of paper. And I would also use visuals like my presentation, my slideshow, and sentence starters. So on the diagram, I would have, if the temperature is cold, the butterfly will blank, and then they can be able to write in what the butterfly will do. The next sentence will be, my evidence consists of blank, and then they will be able to provide their evidence based like that. And that is how I will conclude my Think Aloud strategy for critical thinking for my butterfly life cycle.